What if something as simple as a tariff could shake the world? Imagine this: you're shopping online, buying a smartphone or a pair of sneakers. Nothing dramatic, right? But behind that screen, behind that item, there's an invisible tug-of-war. Governments are clashing. Industries are bracing. Stock markets are holding their breath. And millions of lives are being affected, all because two powerful nations are locked in a long, slow, and strategic confrontation. This isn't just about economics. It's about influence. It's about future leadership. It's about which values will shape our global systems in the next decades: open markets or state control, innovation or protectionism, diplomacy or dominance. And most of all, it's not over. In today's lesson, we'll explore the U.S.-China trade war, not just as a series of tariffs and political statements, but as a deep and ongoing global shift. This is more than a financial disagreement. It may be the defining economic conflict of our time, and you, as an English learner, have a unique opportunity. You're not just learning words today. You're learning how to read the world more clearly. Why does that matter? Because understanding the power struggles shaping global trade helps you understand your future, your job, your country's economy, the prices you pay, and even the platforms you use to speak and connect. So, as we begin this journey, I invite you to stay curious. Let's not just learn English today, let's learn how to listen closely to the forces shaping the 21st century. This story isn't cold or technical, it's real, emotional, and deeply human. Let's start by asking, is this really just a trade war? Or are we standing on the edge of something far bigger? At first glance, the U.S.-China trade war looks like an economic disagreement over tariffs and trade balances. One country imposes a tax on imports. The other retaliates. Negotiators talk. Headlines flash. Markets go up and down. It all seems like a standard disagreement between economic superpowers. But here's a question worth asking. If it's just a trade war, why does it feel like the whole world is watching with such tension? Why are global supply chains being reshaped? Why are countries across Europe, Southeast Asia, and Africa being pulled into this conflict, even if they're not directly involved? Why are issues like semiconductors, 5G networks, artificial intelligence, and rare earth minerals suddenly treated like weapons? Let's take a step back and look at what's really happening. The US and China are not only the world's two largest economies. They also represent two fundamentally different visions of how the world should work. On one side, free market capitalism with democratic governance. On the other, state-led capitalism with centralized political control. These systems produce not only different products, they produce different values. That's why this conflict feels deeper than economics. It's a systemic rivalry. When the US started imposing tariffs on Chinese goods in 2018, the official goal was to reduce America's trade deficit and address concerns over intellectual property theft. But beneath those goals was something more complex, a fear of losing technological dominance. A fear that China's rapid growth could tilt the balance of global power. And China? From its perspective, these tariffs were not just taxes. They were an attempt to contain its rise, to block a future where it no longer has to play by rules it didn't write. So we come to a central question. Is this conflict really about trade? Or is trade just the battlefield for something much larger, a long-term struggle for global leadership? Think about the words used in political speeches and media coverage: decoupling, strategic competition, economic security, technology sovereignty. These aren't terms you use when you're just arguing about steel or soybeans. They sound like the language of rivalry, of an unfolding shift in the global order. Some analysts even compare today's tensions to the Cold War. Not in a military sense, at least not yet, but in terms of ideology, influence, and alignment. Countries are being pushed to choose sides through economic incentives and trade deals. Technological ecosystems are being split. Apps, chips, payment systems, they all operate in increasingly separate worlds. So here's a reflection point for you, as a learner and a global citizen. Do you think we are entering a new kind of Cold War, one that won't be fought with tanks, but with data, trade routes, and competing visions of the future? What would that mean for the average person? For businesses, students, families, and even for the languages we speak? Let's keep going. In the next part, we'll break down the most visible patterns that have emerged from this trade war, the trends that are shaping not just headlines, but everyday life across continents. To understand the true weight of the U.S.-China trade war, we have to move beyond the high-level headlines and look at how it plays out in everyday reality. Because while tariffs may sound abstract, their effects ripple into real decisions, real factories, and real lives. Let's begin with one of the clearest outcomes, the disruption of global supply chains. For decades, companies around the world, especially American ones, relied on China as the go-to manufacturing hub. It was fast, cheap, and efficient. But after years of rising tensions, especially post-2018, we saw a major shift. Companies started what's now called supply chain diversification. That's a fancy way of saying, don't put all your eggs in one basket, especially if that basket is in a trade war. Vietnam, India, Mexico, and even Eastern Europe have benefited as manufacturers relocate parts of their operations to avoid tariffs and reduce risk. Apple, for example, started producing more iPhones in India. American and Japanese companies started rethinking their heavy reliance on Chinese suppliers for key components, from microchips to medical equipment. Another big trend is the technology decoupling. This isn't just about hardware. It's about entire ecosystems. Take the case of Huawei. Once on track to become the world's top smartphone maker, Huawei was hit hard when the U.S. government restricted its access to American-made chips and software. As a result, the company had to scale back its ambitions and build its own operating systems and chip technologies. Now imagine this happening across industries, from artificial intelligence to quantum computing to 5G networks. We're seeing two parallel tech worlds emerge. One dominated by the U.S. and its allies. The other led by China and its partners. Each with its own platforms, its own regulations, and increasingly, its own rules of the game. Then there's the phenomenon of reshoring and friendshoring. Reshoring means bringing manufacturing back to the home country, for example, U.S. companies moving factories back to American soil. Friendshoring, a newer term, means relocating supply chains to friendly countries, nations that are politically aligned and seen as more stable partners. This isn't just about economics. It's about economic security. Governments are now viewing supply chains the way they once viewed armies, as essential to national survival. In 2020, the COVID-19 pandemic exposed the dangers of relying too heavily on a single country for essentials like face masks, ventilators, or semiconductors. That fear merged perfectly with trade war anxieties, pushing countries to rethink who they trust with their supply lines. And let's not forget the inflation effect. Tariffs might be a tax on foreign goods, but in the end, consumers often pay the price. When the U.S. imposed tariffs on Chinese goods, American businesses passed the extra cost onto customers. Prices rose for electronics, furniture, clothing, and yes, even bicycles and washing machines. Now imagine this happening globally. As trade tensions grow and supply chains get stretched, prices increase. Inflation isn't caused solely by trade wars, but these conflicts make it harder to fight. This raises a key question for us as global learners. Are we entering an age where economic decisions are no longer made for efficiency, but for politics? If so, what happens to innovation, progress, and everyday people trying to afford basic goods? There's one more trend worth noting: shifting alliances. The trade war didn't just affect the US and China. It made other countries reconsider their positions. Some nations, like Australia and the UK, aligned more closely with US trade and security goals. Others, like some African and Latin American countries, leaned into Chinese investments through programs like the Belt and Road Initiative. This creates a more fragmented world, one where trade routes, digital infrastructure, and financial systems are shaped less by global cooperation and more by strategic alignment. In short, this isn't just a trade dispute. It's a tectonic shift in how globalization works. In the next part, we'll dig deeper. Because behind these surface trends lie even more complex forces, power struggles, political ideologies, and the silent weapons of the 21st century: data, influence, and economic control. At this point, we've seen how the U.S.-China trade war has impacted global supply chains, inflation, and international alliances. But beneath those visible effects, there's a deeper battle, one not just of goods and services, but of power, influence, and ideology. To understand this, we need to ask a harder question. Is the trade war only about economics, or is it a symptom of a larger strategic confrontation? Let's start with strategic technology dominance. Much of the trade war centers not around steel or soybeans, but around semiconductors, 5G infrastructure, artificial intelligence, and biotechnology. These technologies are not only crucial for future economic growth, they also determine military superiority, digital control, and global influence. In 2019, the U.S. Department of Commerce placed Huawei and dozens of other Chinese firms on an entity list, essentially cutting off their access to U.S. technology. At the same time, China ramped up its investments in semiconductor independence through the Made in China 2025 initiative, aiming to become self-reliant in key sectors like robotics, aerospace, and green energy. This tit-for-tat escalation has led many analysts to describe the situation as a tech Cold War. But unlike the Cold War of the 20th century, which was largely about military standoffs and ideological conflict, this one plays out in invisible code, supply chains, data systems, and patent registrations. Both nations are investing billions in securing dominance not just in who builds the tech, but who sets the standards for that tech globally. Let's take a quick analogy. Imagine a future where there are two separate internets. One shaped by U.S. laws on privacy and freedom of speech. The other shaped by China's principles of centralized control and state oversight. If a developing country has to choose between these two systems, it's not just choosing a product, it's choosing a political future. This leads us to another hidden power: control over information and narrative. Economic wars aren't only fought in ports and factories. They're also fought in headlines, search engines, and news feeds. During the height of the trade war, both American and Chinese media framed the conflict differently. In the U.S., China was portrayed as a rule breaker, accused of intellectual property theft, unfair subsidies, and manipulating markets. In China, the U.S. was portrayed as a declining power trying to suppress a rising nation. Each side carefully crafted a story, not just for their own citizens, but for the world. In fact, much of modern geopolitics revolves around information sovereignty. Who gets to control what people see, believe, and act on? That brings us to financial warfare. While tariffs made the most noise, another less visible weapon was in play: financial restrictions. The U.S. government began limiting Chinese companies' access to American capital markets. Some Chinese firms were delisted from U.S. stock exchanges. At the same time, Chinese investors faced greater scrutiny when trying to buy American technology firms. In response, China started developing tools to reduce its dependence on the U.S. dollar, including launching its own central bank digital currency, ECNY, and pushing for greater use of the yuan in global trade agreements. If successful, this could weaken the U.S. dollar's dominance in global finance, a major shift in how power is distributed globally. Now, let's talk about data, perhaps the most valuable resource of the 21st century. One reason the U.S. targeted Chinese tech firms like TikTok and Huawei is concern over data access. In today's world, whoever controls the flow of data can shape consumer behavior, manipulate elections, and surveil populations. The question is, who gets to own and process data from billions of users across the globe? If a company collects data on your movements, shopping habits, and conversations, is that just business, or is it surveillance? This is why the debate over 5G was never just about faster internet. It was about who controls the infrastructure through which all future data will flow. And behind that infrastructure lie governments, intelligence agencies, and geopolitical agendas. So, let's pause here and reflect. Do you think the average citizen truly understands the power behind their devices, their apps, and their economic choices? Or are most people unknowingly participating in a digital empire, one shaped not by democracy, but by unseen agreements and algorithms? This is where we begin to see the real face of the trade war, not as a set of policy disagreements, but as a battle for the soul of the 21st century world order. In the next part, we'll explore how the public reacts to all of this. Because while the leaders and corporations are fighting a high-stakes game, ordinary people often accept or resist in surprising ways. So far, we've peeled back layers of politics, economics, and technology in the U.S. China trade war. But what about the human response? How have people, ordinary citizens, workers, students, consumers, reacted to this high-stakes rivalry? Let's begin in the United States. When tariffs were first introduced, most Americans didn't notice. After all, tariffs sound like abstract policy tools. But as prices on consumer goods like washing machines, furniture, and electronics began to rise, some families started to ask, why is everything more expensive now? Small businesses were especially vulnerable. A furniture store in Ohio, for example, saw profits shrink because its Chinese-made parts now cost 20% more. The owner had two choices: raise prices or cut staff. Many chose the latter. Yet, the public conversation was divided. Some Americans supported the trade war, seeing it as a necessary move to protect domestic jobs and confront unfair practices. Others worried about long-term consequences, higher prices, retaliation, and a weakened global standing. In China, the government tightly controlled the narrative. State media portrayed the trade war as a sign of foreign hostility, pushing a message of national unity. We must endure hardship for the sake of sovereignty. As a result, many Chinese citizens developed a stronger sense of nationalism. Social media campaigns encouraged people to boycott American brands and support Chinese innovation. Yet under the surface, some Chinese entrepreneurs and workers were deeply anxious. Exporters feared losing clients. Students applying to U.S. universities faced visa delays. Tech firms struggled with sudden restrictions. Let's zoom out now. Across the globe, this trade war has stirred up something deeper: distrust and fragmentation. Countries that used to enjoy seamless trade are now forced to choose sides. Should they do business with Chinese tech giants or American ones? Should they peg their economy to the US dollar or explore alternatives? This binary thinking has made the world more polarized. It reminds us of the Cold War, not with missiles, but with supply chains and software. Now, let's ask something important. Why do people so often accept massive changes without resistance? Part of the answer lies in group psychology. Humans are wired to follow social cues. If the media says a policy is patriotic, people are more likely to support it. If everyone around you blames a foreign country for your economic hardship, you might do the same, even if the facts are more complicated. This is called social conformity, and it happens across all societies. Add to that the role of algorithms, which show us content we already agree with, and we enter what's called an echo chamber. A place where your own beliefs are repeated so often that they feel like facts. Even more, many people find comfort in control. In uncertain times, we tend to trust leaders who promise strength, protection, or stability, even if those promises come at the cost of openness or cooperation. Let's consider this metaphor. Imagine living in a beautifully decorated cage. It's clean, it's familiar, and you're told it's for your own safety. Over time, the idea of leaving the cage feels dangerous, even if true freedom lies outside. This is how trade wars, and the politics behind them, can limit not just goods and services, but ideas, dreams, and global connection. Another layer of human reaction is generational. Many older citizens, especially in industrial towns, support trade protectionism. They remember factories closing and jobs going overseas. For them, the trade war feels like justice, a long-awaited rebalancing. But younger generations, especially those raised in a globalized world, often feel torn. They value international education, travel, and the freedom to build careers anywhere. For them, the trade war feels like a step backward. That emotional divide is crucial. Because while policies are debated in government halls, the effects are lived in everyday life. A student who delays their study abroad plans. A factory worker who's laid off because of supply shortages. A tech startup that fails because it can't access both US and Chinese markets. This is not just economics. It's human experience. So here's an open-ended question for you. In your own country, how are people responding to this global division? Do you see signs of fear, confusion, adaptation, or perhaps quiet resistance? We'll explore that further in the next part, when we turn inward and ask how we, as individuals and learners, can respond with awareness, not just emotion. So far, we've explored the trade war from political, economic, and psychological angles. Now let's bring the focus back to you, the learner, the global citizen, the individual who is quietly observing these powerful forces move the world. What can you do? At first glance, the answer might seem like nothing. You don't control tariffs or trade deals. You don't sit at a negotiation table. And you probably don't own a multinational company. But there's something else, something quieter but far more powerful, that you do control. Your awareness. Understanding the U.S.-China trade war is not just about learning who imposed tariffs on what, or who won more battles. It's about seeing how power, fear, and narratives shape the world we live in. When you see clearly, you don't get manipulated as easily. You start asking smarter questions. You begin making choices that reflect deeper understanding. And that's where transformation begins. Let's take a moment and reflect. Maybe you're a student, or a teacher, or a small business owner. Maybe you're learning English because you want more freedom to travel, to grow, to understand more of the world. That goal is already a form of resistance, resistance against ignorance and passivity. Because when you learn to ask, why is this happening? Who benefits from this conflict? What stories are being left out? You're no longer just consuming news. You're starting to see beneath it. Let's be honest, the world is complicated. And sometimes, those in power want it to feel too complex, so people give up trying to understand. But the truth is this: you don't need to know everything to begin seeing clearly. Start small. For example, the next time you hear someone say, China is stealing jobs, or the US is bullying the world, try this. Ask for context. What jobs? What industries? What laws were broken? What power structures are being protected? Are both things possibly true at the same time? Truth often hides in the nuance, not in black and white statements. And here's something else to remember: you don't need to change the world. You just need to stay awake in it. Staying awake means you notice shifts in global dynamics. You see how a factory in Vietnam or a port in Sri Lanka might be connected to a trade deal in Washington or a Belt and Road project in Beijing. It also means that when you listen to someone from another country, someone who sees things differently, you listen not to win, but to understand. That kind of listening is rare. And it's powerful. So if you ever feel overwhelmed by all this, take a breath and come back to this. You are already doing something meaningful, by learning, by asking, by caring. Awareness is the seed of responsibility. And responsibility doesn't mean carrying the world on your shoulders, it means not looking away. Let's end this section with one more question to reflect on. Do you think most people really want to understand global issues, or do they prefer simple answers? And which one are you choosing, right now? When you're ready, we'll move into the next part, where we'll pause to take note of the vocabulary and language structures we've been using throughout this lesson. Now that we've explored the story from many angles, let's pause and look at some key vocabulary and language structures that appeared throughout this lesson. These words are not only useful for talking about global affairs but also for expressing complex ideas clearly and thoughtfully. Feel free to take notes, pause, and practice these terms in your journal or in the comments. 1. Tectonic shift. Meaning, a major, fundamental change in the structure of something, often used metaphorically. Example: the rise of China represents a tectonic shift in global power. 2. Trade leverage. Meaning, the power or advantage a country or company uses during negotiations in trade. Example: the U.S. used tariffs as trade leverage against Chinese exports. 3. Supply chain resilience. Meaning, the ability of a supply system to recover quickly from disruptions. Example: the pandemic forced companies to rethink supply chain resilience. 4. Zero-sum thinking. Meaning, the belief that one party's gain is another's loss. Example, trade wars are often driven by zero-sum thinking. 5. Hidden agendas. Meaning, secret plans or motives that drive decisions. Example, many suspect there are hidden agendas behind tariff policies. 6. Escalation spiral. Meaning, a process where actions from both sides keep intensifying the conflict. Example, each round of tariffs triggered a new escalation spiral. 7. Economic nationalism. Meaning, policies that prioritize domestic industries and workers over global cooperation. Example, economic nationalism has gained support in both countries. 8. Strategic decoupling. Meaning, the deliberate separation of economies or technologies for security or independence. Example, there's a growing trend toward strategic decoupling between the US and China. 9. Narrative control. Meaning, the attempt to shape public opinion by controlling which stories are told. Example, both governments compete for narrative control in global media. 10. Global interdependence. Meaning, the mutual reliance between countries in economics, technology, and diplomacy. Example, despite tensions, global interdependence makes full separation difficult. Bonus, useful sentence patterns for critical discussion. At first glance, it might seem that, but when we look deeper, one possible interpretation is that, while another perspective suggests, the reality is far more complex than it appears on the surface. We should consider who benefits and who pays the price. This raises the question, how much of what we see is truly objective? You can review these terms throughout the video, or even better, try using a few of them in a comment or journal reflection. Writing your own sentence using these structures will help lock them into your long-term memory. So, after all the numbers, policies, and perspectives, what do we walk away with? Maybe this: the U.S.-China trade war isn't just about tariffs. It's a mirror, one that reflects the deeper anxieties of a world where power is shifting, supply chains are fragile, and narratives are carefully crafted. You've just explored a story that goes far beyond economics. You've seen how politics, psychology, technology, and language all come together in the real-world theater of global power. And you did it in English, not just learning a language, but using it to ask questions that matter. Let's end with one more. What do you think matters more in this trade war: economic interests, national pride, or the desire to control the future? Think about that. And if you have a moment, share your thoughts in the comments below. Not just for us, but for yourself. Writing helps you think better, and English grows fastest when it's used with purpose. If today's video opened your eyes even a little, we're glad. And there's more to come. In the next episode, we might explore another critical issue, one that seems distant, yet touches your life more than you realize. Because learning English is not just about better grammar. It's about better awareness. And sometimes, staying awake in a noisy world. So stay curious. Stay thoughtful. And thank you for spending this time with me. If you found this valuable, don't forget to like, share it with someone who might care, and subscribe for more lessons that go deeper. See you soon, and remember, the better your questions, the clearer your voice.